Welcome to another edition of PropTech Talks, where we talk with real estate executives, investors, entrepreneurs on the nuances of the real estate industry today and how to capitalize on them. Christian, good to have you. I'd love to just hear a little bit about you, how you got to 2150. Sort of a quick overview of you, really. So yeah, good to have you.
So let's start with the reality that 6 years ago, you told me that I would be here talking about my excitement on the chemistry of cement and concrete and the heating and cooling of buildings. I probably would have laughed. Not where I expected to be, and yet here we are. Quick background: a techie by career, did small companies that kept getting large. Big data in the 90s, smartphones at Microsoft, smartphone apps at Google, and then like buttons at Facebook. And then became a VC, generalist VC fund called White Star Capital that I founded. And then had a realization that the tool of venture could be applied to broader impact. Started scoping out where and how to have that impact, and realized that buildings and industry generate 50% of our global emissions and receive very little funding for innovation. And that is where you could have the greatest impact in the shortest amount of time. So that was 5 years ago. Well, naturally, almost 6 years ago, we got started. We did our first investment with 2150 in 2020, and now 5 years later, we're on our 23rd investment, deploying from second fund and trying to decarbonize this hard to decarbonize environment.
Okay, well, that's a great place to start. Really, this second fund. So currently fundraising is. Many investors will say it's a little bit of a lull, especially, last year especially, but it's still a little bit of a lull. However, what actually has convinced you and LPs that now is the moment to double down on urban adoption technology and climate technology?
Yeah, So I've heard a well-known Silicon Valley VC who's on fund 11, 12, whatever it might be, say that this is the hardest fundraising market in 20 years. If you look at any of the graphs in the FT or the Economist, the number of funds raised has massively dropped, like by at least a quarter, if not more. Sorry, 3/4, if not more. From 2021, there was a height. 2021 was also the height of climate tech funds. And then if there is capital available, it's massively segmenting towards the larger Andreessen Horowitz, et cetera, that can absorb hundreds of millions. So yeah, not the easiest market to go raise, period. I do feel bad for a number of my friends who are currently raising their first fund in this market. Solo GPs might find it easier. So yeah, we got lucky that we had a large institutional base for Fund 1. We raised before climate tech became a thing. So we were early in the wave. We were part of that cohort in 2020 before it kind of accelerated in 2021. And so having that institutional base allowed us to have a quick first close of a sizable amount for Fund 2. That being said, we needed to go convince a number of new investors to come in. And it's the US is a very interesting market right now. Somebody said this to me, and I think it's accurate. People who are going to have to be public with their commitments, pension funds, endowments who might have to disclose it, are shying away from, let's call it climate tech or anything that might draw their attention. People who don't have to be in the spotlight, family offices, industrial groups, are doubling down. Which is true, except for one pension fund in the U.S. that became a big LP in Fund 2, Church Pension. It's the pension fund of the Episcopalian Church, the Anglican Church of the U.S., who wanted to effectively invited us to tell the world that they were an investor. They wanted to tell the world that they'd done this. But more of the rest is like large family offices, non kind of public facing groups. It's been Fund 1 we raised in a year and a week.
And why do you think there's that difference between the public and the private, and what does that sort of say about the effectiveness and the effectiveness of investing on climate tech?
I think it's more, so I don't think it's because of climate tech, it's because of the attention that being public would draw right now, especially in the US, where anything with the word climate, DEI, or do good for the world seems to have negative connotation.
Right, okay.
So they just don't want to draw the ire. I mean, if you're the Harvard endowment, $42 billion, and there's a 0.001% chance that your tax status gets taken away, you are definitely going to take very different decisions. Or any other endowment. And so, some of the largest asset managers were getting dinged in Texas because they were using the words climate in their LP letters. So I think it's become a very green hushing has been the word that's been used. Like if you're doing anything climate positive, don't talk about it. Europe, I think, is the opposite. I think actually here people are beginning to like take a lot more action and focus.
Definitely.
The pools of capital are just much more.
And so, I mean, there's two systems when it comes to, I guess, the benefit of climate investing. One is, or the, let's say, a slightly more superficial layer, which is how, what it signals about the company and how it wants to do good for the world, but real, but also not necessarily at the heart of another huge component, which is actually a savings perspective, an operating margin perspective. And in Europe, really to have liquidity on buildings, decarbonization and data towards decarbonization it's kind of a must-have. Now, do you see the world sort of following in that footsteps for I guess us? And I can think about at our event that would seem almost obvious, but where do you see, I guess, globally the mentality going, and what do you think the actual effect will have on returns for companies that can go with it?
Yeah, so I called a number of my portfolio companies the day after the election, make sure they were emotionally okay. I'm like, are you going to change your story in any way? And a number of them that sell into buildings said, no, we've never been selling as a green solution. We've been selling as use us, and for a low cost, you will improve your energy efficiency by 20, 30, 40%.
Right.
That continues. Oh, and by the way, you now have a climate benefit, but that was never the driver. And it was not one CEO, it was like 4 that said the same thing. Mm-hmm. Now, there has been regulation, incentives, tax, and grants in the U.S. that have accelerated some of the deployment. That's being ratcheted down to federal level. However, the utility incentive still exists. Utilities need to actually want to make your building more efficient. There's city incentives and state incentives. Largest carbon tax in the world. Nobody believes it when I say it, especially in the U.S. is in the U.S. It's local law 97 in New York.
Interesting.
At $268 per ton on any building over 20,000 square feet starting this year. That's not the highest by a little bit, it's the highest by a lot. To put in context, the European ETS is about $90. So if you're a building owner of a pre-World War II building in New York right now, which CapEx impossible to decarbonize or make more efficient, you're freaking out. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of lobbying going on to water down the law. It'll probably get watered down, but still, the fact that was in place at a local city level is driving action, just regardless of the narrative at the federal level.
I mean, so there's and I guess that really indicates why now would be the time to double down, because if others don't really know about it, but the clear there's the clear tax incentive in the US, I guess that's where the opportunity is.
Yeah, and in Europe too, like the building you're in right now, right? I'm guessing it's late 1800s, something like that, massively inefficient. We have these large amount of stock of inefficient buildings. The number of EPC buildings in London, EPCC buildings in London alone, which you could argue are going to be stranded assets. Like finding a turnkey way to make those EPC by making them more energy efficient with low cost, impactful solutions makes total economic sense. Mm-hmm. And there's a couple of people who do that very, very well, but on a building by building level. Like it's finding, I mean, Blackstone, Apollo, they all recognize that opportunity. They just don't have the ability to go down and touch 10,000 buildings at a time. Yeah,
makes sense. Let's talk a little bit about, I think, quite a unique part of your journey, the big tech component. I rarely see someone, I think it was Google, Facebook, and Microsoft. Okay. And so going from big tech to venture capital, I suppose what lessons did you take away from big tech to, as you say, use venture capital as a tool to change the world positively?
So they all became big, but every company or business unit that I joined was a startup. So
and they all had one thing in common.
Which is what?
You.
Oh, actually, I do have one friend who's actually in town tomorrow who has worked at every company that I worked with me.
Okay, so they have one thing in common. Both.
Yeah, he's still there. Actually, still at Facebook, Meta. So in the .com days, I was at a company called MicroStrategy, which is now in the news for other reasons, specifically Bitcoin. That was a 200-person company when I joined, grew to 3,000. Then I joined Microsoft, which was already massive, but I joined this startup group that was launching their new business unit, which is their mobile phones. Mm-hmm. We were a tiny group that then became big. joined Google, actually Google Europe, Google London. We had just moved into a new office in Victoria. We might have been 100 people. And I was part of launching the new product, which was mobile. So literally getting your mobile Google for search installed into your BlackBerry phones. And obviously mobile is now the primary access point for Google search around the world. And then Facebook, when I joined, we were under 100 people worldwide, 12 people in London. We had just moved into an office in Covent Garden from a small office in Soho Square. I think there are now 3,000 people in London. So it's still, I mean, MySpace was still bigger than Facebook when I joined. So the commonality across all of those was actually seeing emerging technology scale and being part of either the product team or then eventually the commercial leadership team to bring it to market and finding partners, channels, etc. At Facebook, my role was we had two sides of the business, the ad sales, and then what I ran, which we call the platform, which is people building on top of Facebook. So the Zyngas of the world. My job was to go find the Zynga of Europe. So that was working with the guys who make Candy Crush to put it on top of Facebook. That was working with Spotify to tap on top of Facebook. So effectively, I was a venture capitalist inside Facebook, applying resources of Facebook, engineering, time, attention to these startups. And I loved seeing that voyage. I mean, Spotify, obviously, Candy Crush, Supercell guys, and then wanting to be part of that voyage through a different means, which became venture capital.
And I mean, how much of that, I guess, when you do that kind of deal, how much of it is the platform of Facebook elevating that, the startup, and how much of it is, the strategy of the startup to make people engage with Facebook?
So let's use the example of Spotify, right? So we gave the same virality. Here is, at that point, let's call it 1 billion users of Facebook, and here are all these viral tools where you could see what your friends were playing on Spotify and others, and we gave it to all the music platforms. We gave it to Deezer, and we gave it to Spotify. I think we gave it to SoundCloud. So they all had access to the same tools. We gave them all resources, engineers to actually integrate it. What Spotify nailed extremely well was how to integrate that into their own viral loop to get more users. So we didn't know which horse was going to win. We gave everybody access to the platform. Their own product teams just knew how to innovate better on top of that platform.
And what what that means in practice is their ability to capture their own users' attention using the infrastructure.
To hook somebody from Facebook to come back into Spotify, and once you get them there, to onboard them very quickly.
Right, got it. Okay, fantastic. And so how does that translate to now? I suppose venture capital and climate tech
in the built environment.
Yeah. And because obviously there's that scaling era and that sort of gigascaler era, and now the built environment does move a little bit slower.
Understand
it? Yeah. Perhaps due to the physical nature of it, perhaps to many reasons. What would you say is sort of that a big takeaway that now can be applied here?
Yeah, so I had done business software back in the in the 90s. So I do have some experience with that. And I guess my work at Google and at Microsoft was B2B2C. So I was partnering with Motorola to go build something that you would buy as a Samsung phone. What I did get to see was how you tool up the team, the resources to go into that gigascale component, which I now spend a lot of time talking with my founders on. Yes, the customer might be slower, but there's still signals that will make them go faster. For example, if your first customer is a very high-profile, forward-leaning group like Heinz, that will get you a lot more visibility with a bunch of other people who might be more laggard. So it might take longer to get Heinz on board, but once they're on board, that's a big bellwether that others should be paying attention. Channel partnerships. How do you go to market through others who might have 100 salespeople when you have one? And the ability to actually create channels for distribution. To have channels, you need to have enough margins to share the profitability with them. And then 3, I think what I was good at back in my tech days and I can apply with my founders is what's the pain point, right? What are you trying to solve? When we were selling Google Search to Nokia had their own search portal. So what we were trying to prove to them was that more like for like, given access to Nokia Oi, as it was called, or Google Search, people would choose Google Search. And we did A/B tests in which they got proven, and then they effectively would choose us.
Fantastic. And so, when it came to, let's say, selecting founders, would that be the best way, or investing in founders? It's such a different game they're playing today. Are the traits of a successful founder, are they the same across industry, or you look for different things in climate versus these are they called platform entrepreneurs? Don't know what to call them, but what do you look for? Are there differences and nuances, or is it really is there almost a formula somebody can become successful?
There's a formula. I'll come back to it, but the challenge also, we invest across the urban environment, right? And that's everything, that's buildings, but also infrastructure, water, energy, the pipes that flow in, the factories that feed the city. So it's everything from pure software to low capex sensors, all the way to like physical stuff that's ever been built before. So for each of those, you kind of need different types of founders. I said this in the interviews back in 2012, and I think it still applies today. Like the best entrepreneurs in the world, first of all, delusional. They think they can change the world. Second of all, had to have the competency, be that commercial or technical, to go make that a reality. And then the third one, which is the hardest thing to find with the first two, is they're humble enough to realize they can't do it alone. They then need, if you're the PhD who knows how to do the science, you're going to need the commercial guy to take it to market. That you're going to need capital from other people. That you're going to need to have partners. And it's like that combination of the three that's pretty unique.
Interesting.
The challenge in some of the stuff that we back is that it's groups of 2, 3, 4, 5 PhDs, engineers, tinkers, who have never necessarily run a business or sold something. So how early do you bring in commercial acumen into the team? And actually, this is interesting because we just had a conversation about this at a board recently. At which point do you tell the engineers to stop tinkering? Right. The product you have today is 90% of what you need. Getting the incremental 1, 2, 3% is cute from an engineering perspective, but ship, like the American expression, ship what's in the truck. It's good enough for what your customers need. It's already going to provide them 60% energy efficiency. Getting them 65% is marginal.
Yeah, but and I suppose in the personality of an engineer at that point, there's the side of their life that they love, which is to tinker and to invent and to almost find problems to solve. And I suppose at that point, for the business, they need to sell. There's a point where it starts to need to just sell. So I guess then what is the answer to that question? When does the commercial player, is it right from the outset? Is there a development phase, or does it depend on the product?
It depends on the type of product too, right? So like the physical ones are harder because, by the way, if you're a large building owner, you're not going to swap out your HVAC for something that's never existed before. That might be more efficient, but you don't know. You're not going to be number one. So the kind of trust building on that, the thing needs to exist out in the field for a while for people to be able to look at the data and maybe take the risk. And by the way, they're probably not going to put it in the crown jewel. They're probably going to put it on some side shed for a while. So there's building that trust, and that actually does require the technical skills because you're selling probably to a fellow engineer. Then 2 is the commercial skills. So how do you price it? Like, do you do cooling as a service? Do you do it outright? Do you find a financing partner? This role of CFOs in some of these companies actually happens earlier than you would in some traditional SaaS businesses.
Interesting.
Because you need working capital to build it. You need like financing. I say you have 2 products. You have the physical thing you're building, and then the packaging of that for the capital markets. So we have a company that got 100 million from a Blackstone-based entity to create an SPV to go lease them out to the building owners. Benefit to the building owner is it's now OPEX versus CAPEX. Benefit to the company is they sell the unit immediately to the SPV. Benefit to the Blackstone entity is they make a pretty sweet percentage on that loan facility.
Nice.
We need more of those.
Right. I think one of the sales pitches that I thought was beautifully simple. This was an HVAC solution, and they said they sort of run some numbers on a few sites with a customer, and then he said, "Okay, I'll send you a contract. Sign it to make an extra $1 million a year." That was it. And it's sort of true. Is because he knew that, and basically it wouldn't even give them an upfront cost. He just knew the OPEX saving was so big that even via installation and everything that's about to come out of this, they're basically going to split that.
Take away the friction, right? So the savings doesn't always get you over the hurdle because it's still like might be the first time it existed. By the way, I do love the fact you said HVAC. That's what I say when I go to America. It's HVAC.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, I'm like, HVAC just sounds weird. So yeah, I call it HVAC as well. but it's getting that piece of hardware in there when honestly, like nobody gets fired for buying Carrier.
Right. Right.
So the incumbents are so large, and they claim to sell, same thing with lower embodied carbon concrete, they claim to sell a product that's already good enough. Why am I going to try this new cement that's never been used in the UK before when XYZ has a green cement that is by way more expensive, but they claim it's 30% less CO2?
Yeah, makes sense. Let's talk about Gigacorns. When I first read Gigacorns, I thought, am I missing out on something I didn't know about Gigacorns? So can you explain what a Gigacorn is?
Yeah. So it started as a pithy joke when we were getting started with 2150 about what our mission was, right? So everybody's hunting for unicorns. We wanted to go hunt for gigacorns. So if buildings and industry are 50% of the world's emission, we're talking about 20-something gigatons of emissions on a global basis. Can we find something that can mitigate at least a gigaton of CO2? Mm-hmm. Turns out these are extremely mythical creatures. Like a gigaton, back then when I came up with it, I hadn't computed how big it is. It's unlikely we will find one company that becomes a gigacorn. If my whole portfolio with 2150 from Fund 1 becomes a gigaton, gigacorn, I'll be very happy.
Right.
To put it in context, last year, a portfolio of 20 companies mitigated 1 megaton, 1 million tons. 1 gigaton is 1 billion.
To go.
Yeah.
Fine. 909, 900.
But it took a life of its own. So it was a title for a super return session 2 years ago, hunting for gigacorns. A couple of other VCs have it in their like taglines on LinkedIn. There's a climate tech VC that's writing a book with the title Gigacorn. So yeah, so from a pithy joke, it's become a thing.
What would be your advice to a brilliant but delusional but humble entrepreneur who would like to change the world and is listening right now?
Find out who you partner with, and then figure out the pain point. And I think there's actually enough innovators in the built environment that there's people who might co-create the product with you. Get the first couple of units into a building, validate the science, validate the technology, and then think about the commercial implications, right? What are you going to sell it on as a savings basis? Is it a per month basis? I think what's significantly changed over the last couple of years is that there's enough people who are now been through the cycle once. PropTech companies that have gone public or have been acquired for a scale that you can see the playbook from others. No gigacorns have gone public.
About time one day. Well, actually, almost do even want one to, because it means that we are producing so much carbon.
True. Well, yes. But so my favorite climate exit that nobody calls a climate exit is a built environment one. So there is a 4th generation family company in Germany called Wiesmann. They make boring HVACs and boilers. So Mr. Wiesmann, the 3rd generation, took over a couple of years ago at 32. Pivoted the business towards sustainability, which meant more efficient HVACs and boilers. Controlled the whole company as a family-owned business. Sold that to Carrier for $12 billion.
Incredible.
Significant amount of that in cash. He's now the largest shareholder of Carrier, and quite well off at 38. And one of my LPs, so I'm kind of biased. But nobody had heard about the story. So this German Mittelstand company that got acquired because of sustainability in the built environment.
Incredible. How much has a shift towards profitability become part of the strategy for portfolio companies? Is it something you're pushing portfolio companies to do now that I guess interest rates are higher, capital isn't as obvious, or is it more about still growth and potentially a sale?
So I always argue that the growth and profitability are not mutually independent, and this perception that grow at all costs, and people are like, oh well, Facebook was all about growth. Facebook was actually was cash flow positive very early in its voyage. Google was profitable, I think, year 3. So yes, Chamath was given a lot of liberty to go focus on growth, but we were making significant amount of money. So I don't think you don't have to decouple both. And by the way, the best source of non-dilutive funding is revenue.
Yeah.
So if you want to let your engineers tinker, get more revenue in to let them go tinker. So it's the blend of both, and at what speed. But to your question, yes, EBITDA and profitability has become a lot more important in the last year. Why? First of all, because if you're on a path to profitability, you become more bankable. So financial institutions will see you as a safer asset and will probably give you commercial loans instead of having to raise more capital. fundraising today is very hard. Two, some of these hardware or low capex solutions will be bought on an EBITDA multiple, not a SaaS revenue multiple. So there needs to be a path to that EBITDA and then make it as big as possible, as quickly as possible. And three, if funding markets are really hard today and you have the luxury of not having to go fundraise because you're profitable, pursue that.
Also, from just a fundamental business perspective, even when you just sort of think about a company, and you think
going concern.
Yeah, no, but even when you just think about all of the work people are putting in, and you think, okay, well, it's they're paying X via all of the mechanics of this business to and delivering to lose money per customer means that this whole under the notion that at scale that won't be the case. It's a I'd be a little bit of a I wouldn't sleep as well, I don't think. But knowing you have a robust company, that sort of the demonstration of the value providing to this is, I guess, financial system is the margin you're making and the profit you're making, the EBITDA multiple you're making, or the EBITDA you're making. I mean, I think now it felt like a bit of a wake-up call, this move towards profitability, to sort of business fundamentals that make sense for growing a company. And what do you think about? Am I off there? Or
no, so I think it goes up and down, right? So in the 2008 crisis, Sequoia had their famous "Rest in Peace" deck, which was effectively preserve cash, survive. And then kind of world got crazy on zero interest rates and like growth at all costs, and then now we're back to survive. So I think it ebbs and flows. Yes, to be a long-term sustainable entity, you have to have your revenue and your costs. Your revenue has to surpass your costs, period. There is a pathway in which we, venture capitalists, subsidize that for a certain amount of time until you get there. But you still have to get there.
Yes.
You can't be money losing forever. But especially in the built environment climate space, like I actually some amazing companies that have. Actually, we invested in one that was profitable. It had been profitable for 8 years, 10 years, and we invested along with some other venture capital funds for it to grow faster, and made it unprofitable for a while. Is now back to profitability, but actually the fact is, like, you can find some businesses that were nicely profitable, just not maybe the growth you wanted for venture style returns.
Right. No, I mean that must have been a little bit nerve-wracking for or was that the strategy all along, I suppose?
No, he was very happy. He was paying himself a nice dividend every year and chugging along. But we were like, do you have an amazing product? We think you should think more ambitiously on a more global basis. Can you please take our money?
And just on the, I suppose the last question, where we think things are going now. So, I suppose it's not the crazy 0% money for free days. Do you think we're going back there? Do you think with as people go more towards AI and technology, more AI and data, and the general trend, even with different administrations in different countries, the general trend is still towards sustainability. What do you make of that? Where do you think things are actually heading? Let's say 5, 10 years.
10 years, fine.
I know it's a very broad question, but there's sort of a few markers there that are sending a few mixed signals. So, what do you make of this quite crazy world we're in?
It is a crazy world. I literally wrote a letter to my investors, my LPs, on the impact of tariffs. I had to rewrite the letter 3 times in 2 weeks because it kept shifting. And finally, we just said we're going to ship this with a caveat: this will likely change. So that's been an impact to a number of my portfolio companies that were importing stuff. By the way, there's no way you can get local battery supplies in the U.S. locally sourced. They're all coming from China. Secondly, we'll see what happens in the U.S. now with this big, beautiful bill, but that might trigger a massive deficit, which will have economic implications in the U.S. and on a global basis. For what we do, I think unfortunately, the macro trend continues, which is the world's still warming. There's still the problem is that the events are happening here and there, and you read about them, but you can't compute that they're all happening for the same reason. So the fires in LA, the Valencia floods, people kind of quickly forgot about the 3,000 people that died in Saudi Arabia last year from extreme heat in Mecca. Bangladesh floods over the last couple of years. They're all interlinked. It's just happening a bit too disparately, so you see it on the TV screen and it doesn't affect you. which is why I think we also need to start talking about adaptation and mitigation. So mitigation is the belief you can suck out the CO2 by, you said 5-10 years, by 2030, and eventually 2040. By the way, we're not going to hit our 2030 numbers. It's almost impossible by this point. So therefore, bad stuff starts happening. Already at 1.5 degrees, bad stuff starts happening. How do we start thinking from a urban environment into adaptation and how we adjust for the new reality? So France just did their climate assessment. It came out about maybe 2-3 weeks ago. The French climate assessment law is going to mandate the government and all corporations to plan for a 4-degree world. Forget 1.5, forget 2. At 4, like really bad stuff starts happening, by the way. We have a adaptation 101 report on our website if you want to read what happens at 4 degrees. But the fact that a national government, a G7 government, is now saying, this is somewhat likely, let's plan for it.
Wow.
And so if I was a building owner in Paris right now and that's being mandated, I'd start taking some actions on it.
And can you just elaborate on adaptation versus mitigation? I think for those listening, and I suppose the implication, or potentially even companies that are demonstrating examples where adaptation versus mitigation is showing some kind of return.
Yep.
Yeah.
So yeah, like I said, mitigation is, we're going to solve this. We're going to suck out all the CO2 or stop emitting the CO2 and then suck it out. 94% of venture capital and private equity dollars going into sustainability have been going into mitigation. Adaptation is, no, we're not going to solve it. We need to start adjusting for what's going to happen. Bill Gates and Ban Ki-moon had a great paper about 4 years ago maybe, talking about the business logic of adaptation. And they're like, all right, it's going to take about, I think it was, let's call it 1 trillion, but the value generated from the 1 trillion is 3 trillion. So 1-to-3 ratio of upside for the investment. So the business case is pretty solid.
Over what period?
Between, I think, let's call it 20, I think it was 2040. It was like 10 years of $1 trillion per year.
Okay.
The problem with adaptation is most of it looks like infrastructure, not necessarily VC backable solutions.
Interesting.
This is the Thames barrier. This is actually Venice now has their own version of the Thames barrier. It doesn't work. Because you've seen the floods. This is seawalls for Miami. I mean, if you ever looked at the map of what gets flooded pretty quickly, I'd be pretty scared to have a condo in Brickell Avenue in Miami today.
Right.
So what do you do about it? And by the way, who pays for it? If you know that Miami's going to flood, is that Miami-Dade County? Is it the person building the building? So that's where the funding of this trillion kind of gets disjointed. And then, by the way, how do you measure success? So in mitigation, we have a very clear success metric. It's CO2 equivalent. We need to reduce CO2 by 25 gigatons by 2030, half of that by 2040, zero by 2050. In adaptation, what's success? Nobody flooded. Nobody
is the same. Yeah.
Nobody died. Yeah. In fact, and if you solve it, what's the upside?
I'd need to take it away from you for you to know, right?
So I think that's the challenge with adaptation. How do you define the true north of success? So what have we seen in adaptation? So we have an investment in a hyper-efficient cooling company called Blue Frontier out of Florida. Cool. Cooling is adaptation. If you ever want to read a book to get freaked out, which actually what I read and led me into this world, it's called The Uninhabitable Earth.
Interesting.
Or there's another sci-fi book called Ministry of the Future. Both start with same chapter 1. Temperature and humidity rises to a certain point where your body can no longer sweat. Therefore, by not being able to sweat, you can't cool. Therefore, by not being able to cool, you literally cook your body from the inside.
Jesus.
Yeah. So that is what happens when you have the humidity and temperatures you see in Bangladesh and Pakistan today.
Seriously.
So you need to ship billions of cooling units, not only to keep you comfortable, but to keep you alive.
Right. And then what's powering that?
Well, that's the problem. So the problem is that the current architecture for cooling has not changed since literally Mr. Carrier invented it in 1902 for his pulp factory. It's pretty inefficient. It uses really bad refrigerants, 3,000 times worse than CO2 if they go into the atmosphere. And the ones being sold are not the most efficient ones. They're the cheapest ones. So India is expected to ship 1.2 billion AC units over the next decade. The grid of India today cannot support that energy load.
This is like a carbon heat debt they're going in.
Well, yes, I was about to say, you have the problem, you're trying to solve it with this, that's just going to make the problem worse. So how do you, and by the way, there's very little innovation in the cooling space. So cooling for us is an adaptation in investment thesis. Water is an adaptation investment thesis. We have a problem with water. Where you need it is not where you're making it. And the cost to transport water from A to B doesn't make sense. Yes, there's solutions out there like desalination plants. They're massively energy consuming. They generate massive amounts of brine. They go back into the sea. So we have solutions, but we need more efficient solutions. Actually, that was my lunch today. It was a water entrepreneur telling me about this, according to him, amazingly efficient solution. But we know we have a water problem, and we know it's going to affect people's lives.
I know a number of these smart water. There seem to be very recently very successful. Maybe, and all of them. And even when we talk to, so now I'm just talking to these landowners, developers, asset managers, all of them are taking water, it seems in the last 6-12 months, extremely seriously.
Really? You think it's changed?
Really interesting. Yeah. Very, very noticeably. It's interesting.
So when we did our thesis or deep dive, because we're quite thematic with these deep dives on kind of problem sets, about 70% of our investments come from deep dives. Cooling was one, water was one. We haven't done anything on water yet. We were not going to go build a giant desalination plant. We found two places where water made sense. One was regulatory driven, one was economic. Economic was buildings. If this building leaks or your factory gets flooded, there's an economic value, and that gets covered usually by insurance. But you can't use the factory for whatever, 2 months, so you can compute it. So the solution is water monitoring tools, and there's dozens, not very differentiated, fairly low cost. There were some cool ones that were using like sonar waves to figure out what the leak was.
That's a good one, yeah. That one.
There's also a regulatory piece on it. You need to flush the toilets for Legionnaire's disease. But if you flush it and you leave it on over the weekend, we looked at a bunch, we decided not to do anything in that space. The other one is regulatory, which is PFAS, microplastics in the water.
Okay.
Where there's a regulation to clean the water, but it's not stringent enough. Like you can still get away with quite a lot of microplastics with the current technology before regulation changes and makes you.
Have you seen male testosterone levels in the last 50 years? I actually feel quite bad that I gave you tap water just now. But tap water having, I think it was due to a number of effects, sort of what's going into tap water, sort of building up over time. And actually, sort of, if you're only drinking tap water, you can actually see almost like a 1% decline in your testosterone levels. It's a lot of interesting little things happening through those bodies. So
So where they found traces of that, it's getting pretty scary.
Yeah.
Just Google it in the Guardian. There's a couple of articles on it, but it's a problem. It's a very much urban problem, but especially in urban environments. There are solutions out there. They're just not going to get deployed unless there's a regulatory push to change them. So those are two areas that we focused on. We've seen some stuff that like creates water up from humidity in the air, massively energy inefficient. So that's a big adaptation problem. And then we've also looked at someone like actually there's a cool one. It literally is Israeli ex-military guys taking Iron Dome and applying it to urban fires.
Whoa!
So the Iron Dome shoots missiles to shoot the missiles down. This shoots water bombs.
Whoa!
To stop the fire.
That is very cool.
Yeah. Yes. Are you going to have a giant slingshot in your backyard to protect you in Santa Monica? Probably not. But I thought that was a pretty interesting use.
Amazing. Final question for you. What's next for 2150?
More of the same. So fund one, we did 20 companies. Those mitigated a megaton last year. I mean, the overall portfolio run rate is like almost $1 billion in revenue, 3,800 employees. Take that, do it again. So 20 more. Half of the portfolio was in the US, half was in Europe in general. I do think that we might be a bit more skewed towards Europe in Fund 2. Just simply the narrative, but also we're just seeing a lot more innovation mature to like where we invest, which is Series A in Europe. There's push from regulators here that's kind of being abandoned in the US. We have a lot of old stock building that needs to be made efficient, going back to the EPCC office buildings in London. And then there's incentives from the governments for you to go do that, right? So ETS on operational carbon of buildings coming into effect. People will have a tax if they don't take action.
Right.
So there's a lot of people trying to solve it. But oh, by the way, in this war that happened, which massively changed the gas prices for heating of buildings,
Yeah.
in places that get kind of cold in the winter. So I think there's been a bunch of reasons why Europe might be interesting in the second fund. I mean, it takes us 3 to 5 years to deploy.
I think Europe is number one in the world from international capital going into retrofit assets. So yeah, it's an interesting.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, this building that you're in, and it's I actually personally, having been a failed architect, I like the aesthetics of architecture. I don't think it would have been a great career for me, but this notion of taking old buildings and modernizing them from the inside, right, keeping the gut, but actually making it scratch. There's a building right next to Tower Bridge, London Bridge, sorry, Tower Bridge, built by our friend Basil at Ford Partners. All he does is brown to green office retrofit, and he does it very well.
Nice.
So that building has 3 of my tech companies deployed for the first time in the UK. And by the way, it's stunning. On the outside, it looks like a normal building, but you go inside and it's got all this cool stuff.
What's the name? Do you know what?
TCO.
Maybe we get that as a case study. Maybe we get the guy as a case study on stage for the event. I'm not trying to plug anything, but that actually sounds really cool.
So he's the first. He took the. I literally see it from my office, which kills me every day. They destroyed one of the old shops on Oxford Street, because in the UK you pay 0 tax if you rebuild, you pay full VAT if you retrofit. My pet peeve. So they destroyed it. So he actually somehow got them to authorize taking the steel beams that were like 1900 steel beams to then reuse in that building.
Very cool.
So the first time they've actually, I think, steel had been recycled. He's got my bacteria generated concrete floor tiles, which look like normal floor tiles, but they're actually made by trillions of bacteria. It's called biomason. It's super cool.
That is so cool.
Yeah, so and a bunch of stuff that I didn't back, but they experimented with. Basil does one building.
We need this case study. That is such a cool story. I should know more about this one.
Oh, by the way, it's got this terrace overlooking. Literally, you're like standing over Tower Bridge. So it's pretty unique. We're actually doing an event there for London Climate Action Week with bringing in LPs and climate tech investors. It's pretty iconic.
That is so cool. So cool.
We need Basel multiplied times 1,000 in the UK and in Dusseldorf and in Paris to do this properly.
Amazing. Cool. Well, hopefully with some case studies and people getting inspired, I think we will. Christian, this has been really good. Thank you so much.
Thanks for my time.
Take care.